All right, Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, v'ahavto Yahweh Elohecha, b'kol lavavecha, uv'kol nafesheka, uv'kol ma'odeka. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is your Elohim, Yahweh is one, and you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your resources. Okay, so this week we're going to continue with the intertestamental history. That's the history between the testaments. From the time that Israel comes out of Babylon, which was where we started pretty much last week. And the reason we're doing this is because there are some scriptures in the New Testament that we can understand better if we know what happened between the time the Jews came out of Babylon up to the time of Yeshua. And we'll know a little bit, and I'll demonstrate this when we, by the time we get to the end today, because we will get into some more scriptures than we had last week. We'll get some New Testament scriptures where I can show you that it's what Yeshua and the disciples said and did was affected by how this history went between Babylon and the time of Yeshua, and how the Israelites came under the influence of the Roman Empire. I also have, I wish I could, maybe I can draw this and give you a little, family tree, so to speak, of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. And one of the things I did not mention was, where does this name, why did they come to be called the Hasmoneans? And it is because the high priest, about 2 generations before Maccabeus, was named Cosmon. Cosmon. It looks like Hasmon, but it's the CH, the hard H sound, the Cosmon. And so he was the great-great-grandfather of Mattathias Maccabeus, who was the one who was rebelling against the Greeks, Antiochus Epiphanes, to be specific, and it was his sons, Simon, Judas, and Jonathan, who took turns in kind of leading the revolt. And so it went from Cosmon to Mattathias Maccabeus. Maccabee is kind of a word for hammer in Greek, and actually in Hebrew, and so one of the sons of Mattathias, he was a high priest, just like his father or great-great-grandfather Hasmon. They were high priests, and they came out of, the great-grandfather came out of Babylon, or his ancestors did, and at that time they were still following the lineage of the priesthood, the Levites. So these probably were Levites to start with, and the high priest was supposed to be of the tribe of Aaron, right? So they were paying attention to that somewhat. But later, when the Sadducees party kind of came to be, they were the priestly party, but they weren't real strict on keeping their lineage pure. So there was some Levite in their lineage, but to say that they were totally qualified, and then they come along, some of these Hasmoneans, these Maccabees, come along, and they not only wanted to be the high priest, but they wanted to be the king. And there were some of the Jews who really objected to that. They didn't think that you should mix those two offices. And so that's why we ended up with some of the parties we did. We had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, or the Chassidim, and the Essenes, and the 4th division, which you don't see much of, but it was the 4th division that I mentioned last week, the Zealots. But by the time of Yeshua, we do see Zealots. So it went from Mattathias, he wasn't a fighter, but his sons were. And the last one to survive was Simon Maccabee, and he had a couple of sons, and one of his sons was Jonathan, and he took the last name, or title of Hyrcanus. So he was John Hyrcanus I. He had two sons, Aristobulus and Alexander Jannaeus. And Alexander Jannaeus turned out to be the one who carried the high priesthood and the rulership from Mattathias, Simon, and John Hyrcanus I, and he was a Hasmonean, and when he died, he had two sons, John Hyrcanus II and another Aristobulus. And Aristobulus, he had that Greek name, and he aligned himself. He liked the Greek culture, and he aligned himself with the Parthians, who were a people over or south of the Caspian Sea to the east. And they were very much in conflict with the Romans and the Greeks. The Greeks and the Romans neither liked him. John Hyrcanus, on the other hand, he aligned himself with Rome. And he is the one who had the Idumean, Nabatean advisor Antipater. Okay? When Aristobulus, he had a son, Antigonus, and the Parthians declared him the king and the high priest, but the Romans, in conflict with the Parthians, ended up pushing the Parthians back, and they actually killed Antigonus. And Antigonus, when he died, that was the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. That was the end of the Hasmonean family, and that was in 37 BCE. In 37 BEC. Now we're going to back up a little bit and catch a little bit more of this history, but Aristobulus, his father, and John Hyrcanus II were the children of Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus had a very, well, we might call her a Jezebel, because she was a strong-willed woman, and she actually was the ruler, and this was where the separation of the priesthood and the rulership came to be through her, because a woman couldn't be high priest. I mean, the Jews never accepted that. So she kind of ruled, and her sons kind of stayed away from her because she was a bossy lady. And she ruled until she died, and then her sons fought over the rulership. So, that's down the line. I think we're going to see that in the notes that we go through here now. So we had gone up to Antiochus Epiphanes, and we had brought in these Hasmoneans, who were the descendants of the high priest Hasman, and they're fighting with the Greeks, Antiochus Epiphanes, which he was one of the four rulers. They were part of the four kingdoms that split off from the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire was still, even though it's divided into four parts, it's still the major power in the world, but the Romans are coming on. The Romans are vying with them and taking over some of the territories, getting Greek subjects under them, but they're not strong enough to really be called the Roman Empire yet. So here we come down to about 100 when all of this is transpiring. The Romans are not strong enough because the Romans are constantly having civil wars. Civil war after civil war. But it was in 103 that Alexander Jannaeus came to the rulership of the provinces that became Judea later on, but there was the Galilee and the Idumeans, which John Hyrcanus II is actually going to conquer later on. But he was the high priest and the ruler from 103 to 76 BCE. And he had a pretty strong hand, so he kind of kept those provinces, both the Greeks and the Romans, kind of let the Jews do their own thing over there in Palestine. By 83, we find that the Romans are vying for power. And for the Romans in 83, compromise and toleration have not been working. You know, they've been letting all these provinces pretty much self-govern themselves. They were kind of like a United States of Europe and Asia. And they had all these states. And they had their own, you know, they had their own governors. And sometimes they even called them kings. In 83, General Marcus Sulla returned from wars in the East. East, that's where we're talking about, against the Parthians, and against the Seleucids, that part of the Greek Empire that was governing in Syria. And a bloodbath and civil war ensued, but he took power in Rome. He creates a new constitution that gives rule to the Roman Senate, and he believes that will restore the republic, order, and dignity to Rome. 4 years after he took power in Rome, still not the Roman Empire, still not strong enough, he thought it was, but he retired. He believes that peace has been established at home in 79 and abroad, and that the Roman government is functioning as it had in its glorious past. And so he settles down in his retirement and grows cabbages and becomes an Epicurean. So that's kind of a humorous note there. In 77, around this year, the last book of the Old Testament, the book of Esther, is translated into Greek. In 76, a year later, is when Alexander Jannaeus dies and his wife takes over. And she is in charge of everything except the priesthood from 76 to 67. In 67, the Maccabees family has been renamed the Hasmoneans after the ancestral starter of this line, Hasmon. Two Hasmonean brothers, sons of Alexander Jannaeus. You notice that they have this name Alexander. Well, that shows you that the Greeks had a great influence on the Jews, even the ones who were in the Maccabean or the Hasmonean line, because this guy's name was Alexander Jannaeus. So he took Alexander's name. He dies, his wife takes over, these are his two sons, and when she dies, then the two brothers, John Hyrcanus II and Judas Aristobulus, go to war. They have civil war. They vie, they compete for power. That begins in 76. These are the great-grandsons of John Hyrcanus I, but they're the sons of Alexander Jannaeus. The Idumean connection comes in because John Hyrcanus, who favored the Romans, Aristobulus favored the Greeks and the Parthians, but John Hyrcanus favored the Romans, and he took on an Idumean advisor. Very important that we understand this, an Aramaean advisor from Idumea. The only way he could have been a Jew is, or of the tribe of Judah, or anything to do with the tribe of Judah, was that some of the Judeans that came out of the Babylonian Empire settled in the Nabatean desert, south of Jerusalem. And it is surmised that some of the Idumeans were actually descendants of those Judeans who came out of Babylon, but not all of them, because some of them were actually the Nabatean Arabs. But they kind of got mixed together there. You stick them in a bag and you shake it up and dump it out, and you got a mixture. Well, they were a mixture. But Antipater, the advisor to John Hyrcanus, is very important. And what you're going to find if you check into the history of the Jews at this time and their interaction with the Greeks and the Romans is they were very prone to going where they thought the winner was going to be. They didn't care a thing about the Greeks, they didn't really care a thing about the Romans, but they went where they thought the power was going to shake out. And so that's why Aristobulus went with the Greeks and the Parthians. He thought they were going to be strong enough to withstand the Romans. But John Hyrcanus, with his advisor Antipater, got involved with the Romans every chance they could. They supported the Roman emperor. At this time, you all heard of Mark Antony, right? And Cleopatra. Those were real people. That wasn't a fairy tale. And Cleopatra, of course, being from Egypt, Mark Antony was quite a bit older than her, but that was his lover. And so together they ruled the East, including Judea. And they were at war with the Parthians. And it's Mark Antony, actually, who ends the Hasmonean line, because he is the one who was responsible for killing Aristobulus, or not Aristobulus' son, Antigonus. Okay, that was the end of the Hasmoneans. But we've got this John Hyrcanus, who's got this Idumean for an advisor, and together they support Rome, and eventually John Hyrcanus II declared a leader, and he's the high priest. He's the only one from the Hasmoneans left, and he doesn't have children that continue. Well, actually, he does. No, he doesn't have any children. He doesn't have children, but Antipater does. Antipater has two sons, one that becomes Herod the Great. So he wasn't a Hasmonean. His only connection with the Jews was, did some of the Jews go down to Idumea and mix with the Arabs down there? And he claims they did. And his brother was Phasael. That sounds very Roman, or very Arab, doesn't it? Phasael, okay? So every chance they got, they supported the Romans. In 63, the Greek general, Gnaeus Pompey, you've heard of Pompey, he's in Syria because he fought against the Syrians for Rome. He's kind of like a general, with a Roman army in response to disorder there. Syria is annexed to the Roman Empire. Syria, that was what was left of the Seleucid branch of the Greek Empire. Okay? Now, I know that there's some people who are saying, well, what does all this have to do with what we're going to be reading in the just hang on, and you'll find out. You'll find out. So he annexes Syria. This is how Syria became a Roman province. Syria, just north, north and slightly east of Jerusalem, Judea. Syria is annexed to the Roman Empire. The Hasmoneans still have an alliance with Rome through John Hyrcanus II. And the two warring Hasmonean brothers seek arbitration from Rome. Pompey and his army march to Judah. Fighting erupts between Jews and the Roman army. The Romans take possession of Judah. So 63 BCE, here is when the Romans really start to exert their influence in Judea. And that's when they called this area Judea. Julius Caesar in 58 goes to Gaul as a military governor in the Roman Empire. He's not a Roman emperor yet. He's just a general. In 49, Rome's Senate has worried over Caesar's popularity because he was a great general and he was getting all these victories, and they've ordered him home from Gaul. On January 10th in 49, Caesar crosses the Rubicon. Y'all, how many of you have heard of Caesar crossing the Rubicon? Yeah? Some people here have. Hopefully you'll. I know Mac has. And that was forbidden. That was a forbidden move, which meant civil war. But Hyrcanus II, John Hyrcanus II, supported Caesar, and he is rewarded with favor for the Jews. So Julius Caesar, he was one of the first of the Roman rulers. He's not Roman ruler yet, but he's getting there. And he was one of the first ones who had some authority to make edicts. And he made edicts against the Greek influence. The Greeks wouldn't let the Jews keep their Sabbath. He wouldn't let them, they wouldn't let them do their sacrifices in Judea. They wouldn't, they forbid, everywhere where they had influence, they forbid the Jews from performing their rites, scriptural rites. Well, the Romans were in favor of letting the Jews do whatever they wanted to do. So, and Julius Caesar was probably the first one to do that. In 48, Caesar's civil war, Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar decisively defeated Pompey, who was the general to the east, at Pharsalus, and Pompey then fled to Egypt. In 47, Caesar returned to Rome as a victor. Many Romans think their troubles are over and that they at last have a champion of the people, and he has secured power, and the gods have granted Caesar good fortune. So Caesar, and by the proper name, God, right? Caesar is conciliatory with former enemies. In 45 BCE, Julius Caesar's reform calendar, the Julian calendar, goes into effect. 12 months, January to December in English, 365 days a year, one added in February every 4 years. In his battles during ensuing civil wars, Caesar is supported by, guess who? Antipater and John Hyrcanus. So here they come again. They see his power rising, and they're going to be opportunists. They're going to get on his bandwagon, and they're going to secure more friendship and more favorable decrees from the Roman ruler for the Jews. So a friendship ensues, causing Caesar to make decrees favorable to the Jews under Roman jurisdiction. When Antipater becomes an administrator and tax collector for Rome in Judea, he is permitted to give key positions to his two sons. Phasael, he is made governor of Jerusalem, and Herod is made governor of Galilee. This is the one who's going to become Herod the Great. This is the Herod who's going to kill the babies. But this is not the Herod that John the Baptist speaks against. So, you know, we have this repetition of names, and so sometimes we can get confused by the history. Is there valid history in the New Testament? Well, yes, there is. Yes, there is. When you understand the happenings from Babylon to the time of Messiah, you can actually see that there is history in the New Testament. In 44, Julius Caesar is murdered by Stoic idealists in order to preserve the Roman Republic. Reconciliation has not worked. So some say that Julius Caesar is the first Caesar, and some say his successor Augustus is the first Caesar. So, if you read the book, The 12 Caesars, they list Julius Caesar as the first one. If you read the Encyclopedia Britannica from 1913, they say Augustus was the first Caesar. But anyway, Julius Caesar, not a figment of Shakespeare's imagination. Again, he wrote plays about it, but it was true history. Julius Caesar was the cementing force between the Jews, the Judeans, and Rome. And it's why Rome had such great influence in Judea. Now, things are going to happen in this history that are going to show that some other rulers didn't think so highly of the Jews. And at the time of Yeshua, we know, right, that there's conflict. And the Jews never did want the beast, as they saw it, over them. And they didn't ever want anybody over them who was going to deny them keeping the Sabbath or keeping, the Torah, which the Romans came to do, but mainly because of all the revolts that the Jews perpetrated on the Romans. About 37 BCE. So we're still about 32 years before the birth of Messiah. About 37, the Parthians reconquered Judea, took it away from the Romans. So the Parthians were a strong people from over there, from over in the east. and they tried to push this way. They wanted to put a buffer between them and the Romans, and the Romans always wanted to break down those buffers and go conquer the Parthians. Antony was still alive at this time. He persuaded in 37, because Herod fled to Rome, and because of Herod's always support, along with Antipas, his father, all that support gave them favor with the ones who were ruling in Rome at the time. And Antony and his soulmate Cleopatra from Egypt were ruling in the east. They still were powerful, even though Caesar is now dead about 7 years, and civil wars are taking place because Julius Caesar really wasn't recognized as Caesar right away. He wasn't recognized as the ruler. So Antony, still having great influence, persuades the Senate of Rome to designate or name Herod as king of Israel. 37. Herod. Not a full-blooded Jew or Yehudite, but a mixture of Jew and Edomites, Arabs down there. He's declared by Rome, the Roman Senate, to be king of Israel. 37, 32 years before the birth of Messiah. One of the prominent activities of Herod, when he comes to power, is the elimination of many that he felt would jeopardize his rule as king. So when he comes to power, he executed, this is kind of, tells you the character of Herod, the one who becomes Herod the Great. He executed 45 of 71 members of the Sanhedrin. 45, more than half. And then he put in his own people. He is supported, however, by two of the greatest Hebrew scholars of his time. You've heard of them, Shammai and Hillel. Now, why would two of the greatest Hebrew scholars, strict Jews, if you will, why would they support Herod? Because they didn't want the boat rocked. They were also opportunistic. For Israel, for Jews, they felt it was best to go with the power. And they knew that Herod had the support from Rome. So even though Herod kills 45 members of the Sanhedrin, they go along with him. He makes Hananiel from Macedonia the high priest. And one of the Hasmoneans, who was a relative of his wife, objected. I think it was actually his mother-in-law, objected to that. And so she insisted that her son be made the high priest. So he went along with her. That fellow was kind of young. He does make him the high priest, but then he invites him to a bath party. Maybe you've heard of this, which he had a lot of bath parties in Jericho. And while the young man who was to be the high priest was in Jericho at the bath party, he was drowned. So this is the kind of thing that Herod always does. You know, he killed some of his own sons because he thought they might lead revolts against his rule, because he had more than one wife. See, he had a wife who was from Idumea, and then he marries a Miriam, who is not from Idumea, but she's on the Jewish side, and so he's got sons by both of these, and he didn't know he could trust. So if he couldn't trust him, he killed him. Now Augustus, having come to be a Caesar later on in 27 actually, because he was still doing this when Augustus became Caesar, Octavian. And that is the only thing. Octavian liked Herod. He liked his rulership, but he was very much disturbed by all the family infighting of Herod, We're gonna see that. Okay, in 30, so we're getting closer to Yeshua's birth. Civil war has followed Caesar's assassination in Rome, and it reduces to Caesar's nephew, Octavian, against Antony and Cleopatra. In other words, Octavian, he's vying for power with Antony and Cleopatra, and he wins. Antony dies on August 1st in 30 at the age of 53, and Cleopatra dies 8 days later at 39. And you've seen the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They both committed suicide. Remember how she, and it's a true story, how she shut herself up in one of her pagan temples and had her servants bring poisonous snakes to her. And she stuck her hand in the poisonous snakes, and so she committed suicide by asp. So in 29, after Antony and Cleopatra are out of the way, Octavian returns to Rome a hero. He is to be worshipped as the bringer of peace. And in 27, Octavian renounces his consulship, a high office in the Roman government, and declares that he is surrendering all powers, including control of the army. Whether he was sincere in that, or if he knew because of his popularity with the people, the Senate wouldn't accept that, the Senate rejects all that, returns his powers, gives him a title that has the ring of his being divinely chosen, Augustus Caesar. And of course, that's where we get the term August. If somebody is august, that's pretty powerful. That's a power term. Augustus Caesar. And the Senate makes it law that he is to be included in the prayers of Rome's priests. In appearance, the Roman Republic has been restored because he, in appearance, he was rejecting the power, but the Senate gave it all back to him, and guess what? All the power is still held by Augustus Caesar, Octavian. So he becomes the ruler of Rome, the Roman emperor, in 27 BCE, 22 years before the birth of the Messiah. Now, Augustus is in Rome. He's not in Jerusalem. Who's in Jerusalem? Herod, as the client king of Rome. So that's how Herod got there. That's how Herod becomes so powerful. In 19, Augustus Caesar is associating morality, believe this or not, with the well-being of the state and the pleasing of the GODs. To stay on the good side of the GODs, he has begun a crusade to revive temperance and morality. And the Romans embrace marriage, believe it or not. Just like the Roman Catholic Church today. Rome embraces marriage. He tries setting an example by dressing without extravagance and by living in a modest house. He asks Virgil, this is just part of the history. This doesn't have a whole lot, unless you read Virgil's Aeneid. He asks Virgil to write the Aeneid, a story about the GODs and the founding of the Roman race. So, but that's where his bent was. He was trying to bring peace to the empire. He's trying to be a good emperor, trying to bring morality and such. And then in 5 BCE, Yeshua is born in Bethlehem. Luke chapter 2 and verse 1. Luke chapter 2. So about 15 years, 14 or 15 years of this rule by Augustus Caesar, and then in Judea, here comes this birth of Yeshua, and the Magi come and seek the child. It came to be in those days, Luke 2:1, that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus for all the world to be registered. And this we know is why Mary and Joseph, Miriam and Yosef, were in Bethlehem in the vicinity, the environs of Jerusalem. That's not very far. You can see Jerusalem from Bethlehem. I've been there, done that. And so this is why they were there, because they were enrolling under the census that Augustus Caesar had ordered. And this took place as a first registration while Quirinius was governing Syria for Rome. And if you read the histories, you'll find, yes, this was a genuine governor of Syria for Rome. So then what happens? We see that in the same chapter that the Magi come and ask, well, where is this child that was born king of the Jews? And what is Herod's disposition to everyone who is going to challenge his rulership? You're going to kill him. He's going to kill him. So he asks these Magi, when they find him, he says, well, when did you see his star? And so when did you get the sign of his birth? And they tell Herod about when they saw it, and it was probably, so they're probably coming not in 5 BC, but in more like in 4 BC, and they had seen the star much earlier than this. And so this is why later on Herod kills all the babies when he sees that they're not coming back to tell him where they found him, that he kills all the babies from 2 years under. So, we have supposed because Herod was killing the 2-year-olds that Yeshua was 2, but because it is probably 4 BCE, that's when Herod dies, eaten up by worms, by the way, after he kills the babies. He was just being safe by going back 2 years. Yeshua is probably a year old, probably 1, because Yeshua was probably born in 5 BCE, and Herod dies in 4. Well, in the year 1, we've crossed the line now, and we're no longer in BCE. Now we're in the Common Era. Yeshua is about 6 years old. Augustus Caesar has passed laws that he hopes will reduce interbreeding between Romans and non-Romans. It's not, they considered Romans being a race. Anybody else in our time who considered people of the same race a different race? His name was Adolf Hitler. Right? He considered the Jews being a different race than the Germans. So he considered that everybody who was non-Roman was a different race, and that we should only be marrying within our race, our Roman race. He encouraged marriage. Romans believe in the family. They agree that adultery should be illegal. They believe that the virtue of their women helped win favor for their city from their gods, their mighty ones, and they continued to be disgusted by criminality. So Augustus doesn't sound like too bad a guy, does he? And, by the way, Augustus was appalled at Herod's interfamily struggles and all the people dying within his family. And of course, there were people who had Augustus's ears and were telling him what Herod was doing. And so he even sent a message. I don't know if I've got that here in the notes, but he sent a message to Herod. I don't have it because we're already past that. While Herod was still alive, he sent a message to him and said, we have been friends, but he said, we're not going to be friends anymore. I'm not going to treat you as a friend. I'm going to treat you as a subject, because he was so disgusted with what he was hearing about Herod. Okay, but when Yeshua is 12 years old, in 7, then we read this, Luke chapter 2 and verse 41. Same chapter. There's a lot of years are condensed in this second chapter of Luke. Luke chapter 2 and 41. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the festival of Pesach. And when he was 12 years old, which would have been 7, they went to Jerusalem according to the practice of the festival. And that's when Yeshua was teaching. He was 12 years old. He was teaching. This is why they, by the way, the Jews think of bar mitzvahs as happening about age 13. So even then, that's not in Scripture, but even then the traditions were that 12, 13-year-olds are smart enough to be teachers. Some of these rulers were 15 years old when they took over. In fact, Herod the Great, when he was first assigned to rule in Galilee, he was 15 years old. He was only 15. So they matured a little earlier than we think of people maturing today. Okay, so that was in 7. That was at age 12. And so you know what was happening. Augustus Caesar is still the Caesar, but there's somebody else who's ruling in Judea because Herod was dead. It happened to be one of his sons who became also they went by their last name, Herod. That was kind of their last name. So this is the Herod that we're going to find at the time of John. Okay, so in 14, so Yeshua would have been, Yeshua would have been about 19, so he's still 10 years away from his ministry. Augustus dies. Augustus Caesar dies. His adopted son and son-in-law, Tiberius, becomes emperor. Now, there are some histories say that as he got old, he was 77 when he died, by the way, Augustus Caesar. That was a pretty good age for then. And they say that as he approached 77, he became a little more feeble, and he leaned on Tiberius to help him rule. So Tiberius, some people say Tiberius, his rulership was started before 14 and overlapped with Augustus. But officially, when Augustus dies, Tiberius becomes the emperor. And do we read about Tiberius in the Scripture? Yes, we do. We'll read about it in just a minute. Now, since 150 BCE, Jews called Essenes. Remember I told you when we got to about 150 BCE that the Jews were divided? And I explained to you that we used to say that if there are 7 Jews in a room, you'll have 7 different opinions. Well, in 150 there were 1 people who came out of Babylon, but there were 4 strong opinions: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the other one turns out to be the Zealots. Well, since 150, Jews called Essenes have denounced the Jewish majority as apostate and temple worship in Jerusalem as polluted. And it really was, because we know that among the Sadducees, when Herod was when Herod was appointing high priests, that you could buy the high priesthood, and sometimes there was more than one high priest at a time. That was lucrative, especially if they're both paying, right? So they denounced the worship in Jerusalem. They described the majority of Jews as the sons of darkness and themselves as the sons of light. So now these parties are going on. I don't mean gala parties, but sects. These divisions of the Jews are going on at the time of Yeshua. So when we come later on to the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees addressing Yeshua, this is where they came from. They came from these divisions that came during the Hasmonean period. They live in communes. They share and look forward to Armageddon, Elohim's judgment to the earth. Okay, so they believed. So remember when we said that when we go back to the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Zealots, when we go back to that division, we talked about how they viewed Daniel's prophecies. And of course, Daniel talked about the resurrection. Well, the Pharisees didn't believe in that. All the Pharisees, or I'm sorry, the Sadducees didn't believe in that. All the Sadducees were concerned about was what was going on in the temple. They didn't care what was going on in the outside world. That's why they really didn't oppose the Romans. They didn't oppose Herod. They were, went to bed with him. The Pharisees, on the other hand, believed in the resurrection. They believed that part of Daniel's message. But they weren't concerned about, they didn't know about all that end time stuff, all that tribulation and anything to do with the end time. They said what's important is here and now. What's important is here and now. So why did Yeshua call them all hypocrites? Well, he didn't so much address the Sadducees, but he did address them with regard to the resurrection, right? But he called the Pharisees hypocrites because they picked and chose. They didn't believe all the scripture. They believe some of Daniel and they don't believe the other part of Daniel. They misapply it. So Yeshua called them hypocrites, didn't he? We all remember that. So that relates to, that history relates to what Yeshua was going through and preaching against. And then also the Pharisees and the Sadducees, when they took over the teaching of the scripture and they came out of Babylon, they had something else besides the scriptures. They had oral traditions, what we would call oral law. And so that was another reason why Yeshua called them hypocrites. Because just like the Jews of today, they said the oral law was superior to the written law. And that's why Yeshua takes them to task. I think it's in Matthew 23, and he says, you go to the ends of the earth to convert one convert, and then you make them worse than yourselves, worse than hell, if you will. So this is where this history of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Zealots, this is where this history is coming from. And this is what Yeshua is dealing with at the time of his ministry, and the apostles the same thing. 28. This is 2 years before Yeshua's ministry begins. Well, actually, he's about 30 years old. Well, actually, he's a little older than that here, because his ministry probably started in 26, at which time he would have been 30. So here he's about 32. It's about one year before the Passover, where he's going to be put to death. And in 28, like the Essenes, John the Baptist has seen perversity in Jewish society. He's envisioned the coming of an Armageddon that will bring a new Israel under Elohim. So did he get that Armageddon from Daniel? Probably. Rather than stay separated from others, as have the Essenes, though, John joined various others who traveled around Galilee preaching. John made verbal attacks on the Judean king who is a client king of Rome, Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. So here is Herod Antipas. His first name was Antipas, and he's Herod Antipas. He's the son of Herod the Great. John, around this time, give or take a year or two, is imprisoned and executed. Now, Luke chapter 3. Here is how that history relates to what we read in the scripture. In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, so about 28, 29, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Yehuda, and Herodes, which is really Herod Antipas, district ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, district ruler of Yetur, and the country of Trachonitis, and Lucianus, district ruler of Abilene. They were all Herod the Great's sons. Herod the Great's son Antipas was governor of Galilee. Herod the Great's son Philip was governor of territories northeast of Palestine. Now, Philip Herod in the northeast dies. And he leaves a wife, but he had children. Notice what it says in Luke chapter 3 and verse 19. Herod, the district ruler, being convicted by John the Baptist, concerning Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. See, Herod Antipas deposed his Nabatean wife and married his brother's wife after he was dead. And you'd say, well, what's wrong with that? That's against the Torah. The only way you could have your brother's wife is if he died childless and you had to raise up seed to him. He did not die childless. So it was against Torah for Herod Antipas to have Philip's wife as his own wife. And John is preaching Torah to Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas doesn't like to hear it, and especially Herodias, Philip's wife, who was now the wife of Herod Antipas, doesn't like to hear it. She doesn't like to be called an adulteress. So she persuades her daughter, Salome, at her birthday party to ask for the head of John the Baptist as a present. And he said he'd give her anything up to half the kingdom, so he really didn't. He was convicted of him. He thought that this guy really is a Jewish teacher. He's a Yehudite teacher. And so he didn't want to do it, but he was bound to do it. He had to keep his promise. Because he had convicted him not just for his brother Philip's wife, but for all the wicked deeds which Herod did. He added this to them all, and he locked up Yochanan in prison, and then Herodias, or Herod Antipas, is persuaded to behead him while he's in prison. Okay, and then in 30 AD, this is what the secular history says now. In 30 AD, a young man whose name in Greek is, Jesus, but he was never called that. This is Yeshua. He has created a following of his own while recognizing that there is none greater than his former leader, John the Baptist. This is from a secular point of view now. This year, give or take a year or two, this is what the secular historians say, give or take a year or two, but it was in this year, year 30. That's the right year. He goes to Jerusalem for Passover, and there creates a disturbance. He is executed by stoning if convicted of blasphemy, and by crucifixion or for some other offense. Well, he was convicted of blasphemy, and there are some who claim that as he walked up to the stake for the impalement, that he was stoned, didn't die from the stoning, but that the stones were cast because the Jews considered him a blasphemer, because he claimed to be the son of Elohim, Yahweh, and he used the name Yahweh. So they wanted him executed, but they didn't. They were still a territory under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, a Roman, and so they were limited in what they could do. They were limited, and so they asked the Romans to kill him. Luke 13:31. On the same day, this probably happened this year before he was actually killed, there came certain Pharisees to Yeshua. Apparently not all of them were opposed to him. And they said, "Get out and go from here, for Herod Antipas, Herod, wishes to kill you." And he said to them, "Go say to that fox." So this is what Yeshua was responding to. This is the individual he's calling a fox, the son of Herod the Great, the son of the man who killed all those infants at the time of his birth, and then within months was eaten up by worms and died. He said, "You go say to that fox, see, I cast out demons and perform healings today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected." So that was the exact time when Yeshua was there in Jerusalem for the Passover, and he calls this Herod a fox. All right. So from this history then, we can see the divisions of the parties in Judea, among the Jews, if you will, after Babylon, some resulting in rabbinic Judaism and oral law. We see defined relationships with the Herodians and the Romans, and why there was a Herod at the time of Yeshua's birth, why there was a Herod at the time of Yeshua's death. Now, there's more interaction of the Romans and the Jews, and you can read that in a book called The Jews in the Roman Empire. Very interesting history. Maybe I'll even give you some more of that later. But this is what Yeshua is up against when he begins his ministry. You see these people, they're real people. They're real people in the scripture. And so more verification that, hey, somebody just didn't make this up. These are the real people of history. And these are the real times when they occurred. So I hope that you can see why I took all the time to go through all this history and the importance of what happened with the Jews from the time they came out of Babylon until Yeshua. And you can appreciate what Yeshua and his disciples and what the early believers were going through. Now, a lot of the Roman interaction has to do with what happened to the true believers after Yeshua's death, and why they got kicked. The Jews who were still under Herod, but until 70 AD, they didn't want to have anything to do with these believers in Yeshua because, they had conspired to get the Romans to kill him. And so, they had to stick to their guns. But then there were others, there's zealots, there are Essenes who are fighting against the Romans after 70 AD, at 70 AD in the rebellion, 135 AD with, what was his name? Simon Bar Kokhba, who in 135 led a revolt, and millions of Jews are killed and slaughtered by the Roman Empire because of that interaction between Antipas, Hyrcanus II, and Herod with the Romans, and then all these little rebellions, and because they had favor at one time, now they're really, they don't like the fact that these people are always rebelling. So let's just get rid of them. So that gives you a little bit of the history and the interaction, not just up to the time of Yeshua, but even afterwards, for this intertestamental, if you will, history and how it all came about. So may Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and give you his favor. Yivarekecha Yahweh vayishmerecha, Ya'er Yahweh panav alecha v'kanecha, Yasa Yahweh panav alecha v'yasem laka shalom. Any questions?